such large numbers still on the second last day of this conference of the parties. Let me perhaps begin by saying something about this event and then leading over. And I want to pick up on something that Rachel just referred to. Here in Cancun, there are in fact two summits happening. And perhaps it is a little bit more obvious in Cancun because they are physically more separate. And I have to say, for the ones who are able to come to this summit here, they can leave Cancun with a great deal of optimism. And I think this is one very important message we need to take away from here. Those who argue that with Copenhagen and its so-called failure, and I'll explain to you in a minute why I call it a so-called failure, I think many thought that, climate momentum on policy, on action would simply dissipate. I have seen more in the few days that I've been here and the events that I've come to attend here that tell me that in fact the momentum has accelerated since Copenhagen, and that is something that is very counterintuitive and that is actually not something that I would have predicted even before Copenhagen, and certainly not since Copenhagen. And I think in that sense Cancun has to be judged with two very different lenses. The summit that is happening across the road, the bus journey, is a summit that some wanted to drive to such low expectations that it could not fail. I think that's wrong. I still agree, I think, with how President Calderon has, in a sense, engineered this discussion, that you don't walk in here pretending that you can somehow climb back on the horse overnight. I think what he has tried to do with his team is to create a summit where you can recover the momentum. Now, we'll know by tomorrow evening whether that recovering the momentum will yield sufficient results to make people feel that there is momentum towards essentially achieving what this whole process is about, which is agreements and not just talks. I would say one indicator of success is that actually the whole world has come back to the table, and not at the level of the third and fourth level in the ministry. No, most ministers of the world are here. They're back at the table. I attended a lunch today with President Calderon, which he had invited the heads of states and government. There are not many here, but that is not really a failure. I think the fact that some have come, that they have backed up also the initiative of Mexico to try and make the summit more than just a kind of parking lot along the way to Durban or somewhere else where people would hope that a summit would yield something, is important. The other reason, and that's why I call Copenhagen only a so-called failure, is that I'm increasingly worried by this notion that people are seizing on the process instead of the actors that are not acting. The fact of the matter is that in Copenhagen, there was a deal on the table, and close to 170 countries were ready to make that deal. So why is the process so fatally flawed if 170 countries were essentially ready to embark on a journey that is fundamentally going to transform our economies, whether you take the energy economy, transport economy, infrastructure, because this is what was and is on the table with climate change. It is a fundamental transformation of the way we envisage development, whether you call it low carbon, sustainable, green economy, choose your labels, everybody can have a different entry point, but at the end of the day, Copenhagen brought us that close to having the most far-reaching international agreement ever. And I would argue in the end, more far-reaching than the WTO, which is largely regarded as the most transformative agreement in economic policy terms that we have ever negotiated as an international community. And the reason it did not happen was not that the process was fatally flawed, that the United Nations had failed. No. I think it is time to start looking at who is making this process fail. Who is holding the majority of the world hostage or at ransom when there is actually consensus amongst the vast majority to move forward, but for very particular reasons, certain countries are not allowing the process to move forward. And I think that changes the focus from getting exhausted about the event and the complexity, which you quite rightly mentioned. I think there is a point at which we have reached a complexity that is very difficult to understand and to manage. But what is happening is that people are making things complex in order to stop the process from moving forward. And that is why even negotiators can hardly understand anymore what it is they're actually bracketing unless they have two advisors with them who happen to have spent the last year working on that, which for the majority of countries is actually impossible. So 3/4 of the people who are sitting here negotiating are actually not able to negotiate. It is one reason why we took the decision after Copenhagen to produce this emissions gap report. I felt very much with a number of my colleagues that we had to give the world something back with which they could look at the climate process in terms of first principles. And you know, any kind of yardstick you use is not perfect, but this gigaton yardstick was one way of getting back to being able to say, are we actually making a difference in terms of what this whole thing is about, or are we failing? And it has been interesting to see how this simple document that just brought together a number of climate researchers, models, etc., keep your models in the annexes. That's your work. But help the world understand what you're actually finding in a very simple way. So, where will we be tomorrow? I think we will have proven to the world that those who might have believed or hoped for that the climate process will implode, that they are wrong. The world is back at the table discussing climate change and also the response to it. And it is doing it with every nation on this planet at the table. Secondly, Cancun will not deliver to anyone a reason to say we are back on track in terms of the emissions reductions, in terms of the responses on any kind of quantitative scale that is commensurate with what the IPCC has given us as the best possible yardstick right now. The world is on a path to failure right now in terms of its ability to act on climate change. And whether you take the gigaton gap, whether you take the latest research of the WMO and so on, that is a fact. But does it mean that we cannot recover the momentum? No, I don't think so. And I actually think we have to become more determined, more creative, and perhaps begin to understand also that climate policy making, even in a multilateral context, may have to evolve with not everybody in the front carriage of that train. Now this is very difficult, but I think this is the challenge that we will have to think about when we build off Cancun towards Durban. Because if you simply repeat Cancun in Durban, you will be at the same point that we will be by tomorrow night. And I don't want to be misunderstood. I think Cancun has within its reach at the moment sufficient results to make people believe that there is a possibility in Durban to reach an agreement. And I think that will be the yardstick. But let us also be honest, to anybody outside these walls, that is almost not communicable. This summit will be exploited by those who want to weaken international climate action as proof that nothing is moving forward. And I think to some extent we have to live with that. But for those of you who are here, and particularly for those of you who have been in this part of the summit, or this summit, I think you can leave from here with a certain degree of confidence that actually people, subnational authorities, governments, mayors, corporations are actually moving ahead of where the negotiations are. And I think it is in part in anticipation of the fact that there will be, in the end, a result in the negotiations. So that is my take on Cancun at the moment. I know many will not agree, but each one of us have to look at these things through our own lenses. And I certainly don't want to convey to you a sense of exuberance or undue optimism. But I think it is also one of the roles that we play, those who are privileged enough to be close to the process, that we don't allow simplistic interpretations to be used in the world at large for political ends. What does all this mean for Rio? I was too young to be in Rio. No, not too young. I probably didn't have the money to travel there and be in this great event.
A baby.
A baby. So when you two start talking about all these things, I have to say, well, I heard about it. I actually heard about Yolanda very soon after the summit, and I later met Rachel when being at the IUCN. At the moment, quite frankly, this summit is devoid of content and purpose. And we are only 18 months away from it. That is very bad news. We have not been able to develop an intellectual leadership or a narrative for this summit so far within the preparatory process, which is, again, very short. We in the United Nations have just begun to constitute ourselves as, in a sense, the organizing platform for it. Let us also be frank, Brazil had an election. I don't think Brazil has so far been able to offer a vision for this summit either, which is worrying, because it is very much also in the host country's hands and role to help shape a summit. And not in the sense of dictate, but of the kind of work that takes place in the months leading up to it. Now, I only say this with my partial Brazilian roots, because otherwise I'd be in deep trouble with my colleagues in Itamaraty, but facts are facts. So where do we go from here? I think we have to begin to learn a lesson from Cancun, which is precisely in this part of the summit here. And here I would say the world has changed a lot since Rio. You know, in Rio, you had a little bit of a sort of Berlin Wall moment. You know, you sort of push against wall, suddenly the wall breaks open and victory is declared. What you then do when you get to the other side of the wall has been the story of the next 18 years, and it is a very mixed story in terms of civil society suddenly being at the table, in terms of ideas that Brundtland and others had begun to articulate, beginning to shape our discourse, to the point where anything today that has, you know, any function in society has the label sustainable in front. And sustainable development has become almost like an elastic band. It's a task that Yolanda and I tried to take on when we were together at IUCN, to say, what does sustainable development mean in the 21st century? Because it has to some extent lost its scientific definition since Rio. It became an encompassing concept that allowed everybody to stretch the rubber band to incorporate what they wanted to be part of this sustainable development universe. And we had a very interesting process at the time, the future of sustainability. And interesting enough, a number of NGO leaders argued that the whole concept should be thrown out. Sustainable development had been abused, it had been diluted, and it no longer served the purpose. I disagree. I still disagree. At the same time, I think it is simply not good enough to go back to Rio 20 years later with a framework that says, well, you know, we did a great thing in Rio. We were right, and we actually told the world what it needed to do, and we even told it how to do it. It's called Agenda 21. Well, first of all, I think, again, those who say, well, sustainable development failed, didn't cause anything, please open your eyes and look around the world. So much has changed. So many things that, you know, in Rio were the kind of visions of revolutionaries, but who ultimately didn't believe it would ever happen, have actually begun to happen. So it's not at all a story of failure. Again, the problem, however, is that we are being too slow. As humanity, we are simply not catching up with reality. And that is, I think, one key question we have to address in Rio. We cannot continue to say that we're all moving in the right direction and we're beginning to see the kinds of changes we want. And virtually every indicator in terms of our planetary well-being, in terms of sustainability in global aggregate terms, which sometimes hide very different stories, is pointing in the wrong direction. We are still accelerating the destruction of the life support systems on our planet. Go in the atmosphere, go to the biosphere, go to the oceans, go to fisheries, go to soils. We talk about food security, and yet we allow an agricultural paradigm to prevail at the moment that is still destroying the very layer of 60 centimeters of topsoil on this planet, on which virtually everything depends. And the very same people who go out and say, oh, food security, and we need to feed people, are the ones who then promote a model of development that is destroying the very foundation on which we need to grow food. Now, if all of that is happening, then one question we have to ask ourselves in Rio is, how do we accelerate and scale up those examples and models of a different kind of development that in fact we see all over the world emerging at the moment. We know that different pathways are possible. We actually see them every day. You see them in your work, I see them in my work. Some of them stunning. It is one reason why in the work that we are doing in UNIT, we picked up on the work of many of you and the many examples that actually show that addressing environmental imperatives to act really have become imperatives. In Rio, they were still desirable. They were maybe necessities. I think we have reached the age of the imperative to act, because we are, whether you use the notion of tipping points or the climate change scenarios. We are increasingly reaching what also my colleagues in the Stockholm Environment Institute have referred to the planetary boundaries. And in that context, I think Rio, 20 years later, has moved from the kind of, this is wrong, we shouldn't be doing these things, to, unless we change, and we learn to change much faster, you actually no longer have the choice to change. So that's another dimension that I think has to move to the center of our attention in Rio. And here I think the concept of the green economy, which in so many minds means so many different things, is one that to me is critical, because I think one of the things we have to appreciate is that in defining the sustainable development paradigm, we provided some intellectual and analytical order to a world that is divided into those who believe that economics drives everything, or that social and equity issues are the only defining yardstick of what should happen on this planet, and the others who think that environment is the foundation of life and therefore everything else has to be subordinated to it. The three pillars were great at the time. I think they've increasingly become a liability in terms of understanding how sustainable development can really happen in a different way. And I believe that in pushing very hard a discourse around the concept of green economy, we're not providing an alternative ideology to sustainable development. That's not the point at all. What we are trying to do, or what certainly I associate with this discourse, is that we take the simple fact that there is an environmental sustainability imperative today to act. But unless it can answer to social and economic outcomes, we will continue to have another 20 years of the kind of parallelism that we have seen in these different universes. And that is why I think Rio has, in 2012, an enormous challenge to articulate a further evolution of the sustainable development paradigm, not replacing it. I don't think Rio was wrong, but I think Rio is just like everything else, something that has matured, or the world has matured alongside the concept, and the concept hasn't really evolved further. And if we are going to achieve the kind of scaling up and acceleration of actions in a global community of 190 plus nations, with 3 billion extra people just in the next 40 years, with the demands and anticipations of 2 million people who don't even have access to electricity, to basic needs in today's economy, we will have to confront one very simple fact. We will have to grow our economies. The question is, are we going to grow it under the kind of primitive, I use that word very deliberately, primitive yardstick of gross domestic product and the other economic indices we have today? Or are we going to try and develop a paradigm for economic development that is driven by a very different set of models? At its simplest, it is to de-link the growth of our economies, or simply the amount of food that we have available to feed 9 billion people, from the kind of resource consumption patterns we have. We know it is possible, but how to do that in a global community of nations that think they cannot talk to each other because one will define the paradigm of development through the lens of Mother Earth, the other one will define it through the right to drive an SUV, and the third one will define it through, as China is currently, a perspective of ecological civilization. And that conversation, I think, has to find a new way into Rio. What scares me the most, however, at the moment, I don't see the points of confluence leading up to Rio.